Chapter 1: Invitation to Dangerous Territory. Donald Trump's office was the same as always, luxurious but understated. A huge panoramic view of Manhattan, a massive oak desk, several phones that rang every few minutes, and a large leather chair in which he sat, studying documents. The day was going on as usual until his advisor, Mark Wilson, walked into the office with a folder in his hands. He looked a little tense, which in itself was cause for concern. "Mr. Trump, I have received an invitation." Trump looked up lazily. "From whom?" "From the organizers of the Global Conference on Politics and Society. This is one of the biggest events of the year. There will be leading economists, politicians, public figures, media representatives." Trump put down the pen and picked up the folder, opening it. "A major event, then." "Interesting." "Mr. Trump," Mark coughed, trying to find the words. "We studied the guest list, and there are many people, let's say, who are not among your supporters. Especially journalists." "Yes." Trump chuckled. "For example, Sarah Miller." At that moment his face changed a little. "A name that speaks for itself. Sarah Miller is a star of liberal journalism. A host of high-profile interviews, known for her tough questions and ability to drive her interlocutors to emotional breakdowns. She has already stumped senators, Hollywood stars and even some heads of state. Are you sure you want to go there?" Mark asked cautiously. Trump chuckled. "Why not?" "Well, first of all, they clearly want to use you for ratings. Secondly, it could be a trap. If you refuse, they will say that you are afraid of difficult questions. If you come, they will try to put you in an awkward position." Trump leaned back in his chair. "You know, Mark, I've always liked challenges. When I was in business, everyone said I had no chance of success. Then I became president, and they said I had no chance either. Now they think I'm afraid of questions. Let them try." Mark sighed. "Okay, but if you go, we must be ready." "We are ready. Ready for battle." Over the next few days, Trump's team spent time brainstorming potential questions that might be asked at the conference. They knew Sarah Miller's style: she would start softly, with a friendly smile, but then quickly go on the attack. The main topics that might come up were: Trump's political legacy is criticism of his decisions during his presidency. The future of the Republican Party, hints of internal discord. Personal life, possible questions about Melania. Mark suggested a strategy: stay calm, change the subject, use humor. But Trump just chuckled. "Mark, I know what to do. I was doing this back when you were in school." Conference day. The day of the conference arrived. The hall was huge, decorated in a modern minimalist style: light walls, metal structures, huge screens broadcasting everything live. Influential people gathered here: politicians, experts, economists, journalists. In the center there was a stage with chairs, where invited guests answered questions from moderators. When Trump entered the room, his appearance did not go unnoticed. Journalists immediately began taking pictures, cameramen aimed their cameras, and the audience began to buzz. He walked past, as if not noticing all this. With a slight smile, a confident gait, everything as always. Sarah Miller was already seated in her seat in the front row. She tilted her head slightly when she saw him and smiled. They both knew that the real match was about to begin. Chapter 2: The hall, the cells, the waiting, the silence before the storm. The conference hall was decorated in a modern style: high glass walls, huge screens broadcasting the names of the participants, and a stage with a panel of speakers, where several invited guests were already seated. The front rows were occupied by journalists, analysts and opinion leaders whose articles and speeches shaped public opinion. Trump walked into the room with his characteristic confidence. He was unhurried, but his presence was immediately felt. Some of the journalists began to whisper quickly, discussing his appearance, some were already taking notes, and cameramen pointed their cameras at him. The conference host, an elegant woman in a dark blue suit, welcomed all the guests and announced the program. Today is a special day for us. We have invited leading politicians, economists and public figures to discuss the most important issues of our time. And, of course, one of our main guests was the 45th President of the United States, Donald Trump. The hall exploded with applause, some of the spectators supported him, some clapped simply out of respect for the rules of the event. Trump sat in a chair on the stage, crossing his legs and leaning back. He scanned the audience with a slight half-smile, as if he already knew what was coming. Sarah Miller is an opponent worthy of a fight. In the front row sat Sarah Miller, a woman who knew how to ask questions that would throw people off balance. She wore a dark green pantsuit, her long dark hair neatly styled, and her eyes were filled with excitement. She ran her hand over the tablet, making final notes, and then looked up at the stage. Their eyes met. Trump smiled faintly. Sarah knew this conversation would be an event. He wasn't one to be afraid of provocations, but she wasn't one to be afraid of strong opponents either. When the host announced the Q&A session, the atmosphere in the room changed. Everyone knew that something really interesting was about to begin. The beginning of the discussion is preparation for the first strike. The first question was asked by one of the analysts. It concerned economic policy and tax reform carried out during Trump's presidency. Donald answered confidently, citing figures, statistics, recalling how jobs grew and the economy strengthened. The audience reacted differently, some nodded, others frowned, but no one could deny that he knew what he was talking about. The next few questions were about international relations and security policy. Trump answered in his usual style, firmly, confidently, with a dose of sarcasm and jokes that occasionally caused laughter in the room. But everyone understood that the real moment was still ahead. And when the presenter announced, "The next question will be asked by Sarah Miller," the hall fell silent. She stood up slowly, took the microphone and smiled slightly. "Mr. Trump, my question will be a little personal." Trump's smile widened. "That's usually how your questions are, Sarah. Go ahead, surprise me." Someone in the room chuckled, but the tension only grew. "Do you think your wife is happy? Or is she just a shadow of your image?" The question sounded loud. Harsh. Clear. Some journalists in the room winced, the attack was too sharp. But Trump didn't even blink. He leaned back slightly, assessing her. "Interesting question. Is there really nothing more important for you to discuss besides my wife?" Sarah had no intention of backing down. "I just think that many people would be interested to know what it's like to be around someone who is always in the spotlight. Doesn't that put pressure on Melania?" Now the hall did not move at all. But Trump, still calm, looked at her and answered slowly. "You know, Sarah, here's what's funny. People who have never spoken to my wife somehow think they can tell you more about her life than she can. How does that happen?" The answer was perfect. It didn't dodge the question, but it didn't give the reporter the reaction she wanted. The room began to whisper. Sarah thought for a second. Trump continued. "You want to know if my wife is happy? Of course she is. She is a smart, independent woman who makes her own choices. And if you are so interested in her opinion, why don't you ask her directly? Or do journalists now just make up stories instead of people?" Some in the audience even applauded. Sarah pursed her lips but still held on. "So you think that the public has no right to discuss the personal lives of public figures?" Trump grinned. "Oh, it does. But discussing it is one thing, and making it up is quite another. You see, Sarah, you're trying to make a story out of this, but the only thing that's really interesting here is how you're trying to make me justify myself for my family. And you know what? I won't." It was a hit. Clean, perfect. Sarah was silent for a second. Pause before the next round. The room was looking at each other. Trump had just shown that he wasn't just answering questions, he was controlling the conversation. Sarah pulled herself together. Okay, Mr. Trump. Next question then. She flipped through the notes. What do you say about rumors that Melania does not always support your decisions? Trump laughed. Are you married, Sarah? She raised an eyebrow. I am a journalist. It doesn't matter. So, not married. Then let me explain, in marriage, two people can have different views. This is called being adults. If you think that any wife always agrees with her husband in everything, I have bad news for you. The audience burst into laughter again. Sarah frowned slightly, but Trump continued. But here's the difference, when Melania and I have different opinions, we discuss them at home, not through newspapers and talk shows. This may be hard for you to understand, but not everything in life is done for the sake of headlines. Applause again. Sarah felt like she was losing control. But she still had a few trump cards left. And in the next chapter she will try to go all in. Chapter 3, The First Strike, the Melania Question. The room held its breath. Cameras were trained on the stage, cameramen froze in anticipation, the audience tensed. Sarah Miller straightened up, her gaze tense, confident, ready to corner her interlocutor. Mr. Trump, do you think your wife is happy? Or is she just a shadow of your image? A loud, sharp question. It sounded like a challenge, like an attempt to upset the balance, to put Trump on the defensive. But Donald Trump was not one to play by other people's rules. He didn't answer right away. He paused. He used that pause not just as a way to think about his answer, but as a tool to let the audience feel that he was not in a hurry, that he was not flustered, that he was in control. He leaned forward a little, clasped his hands together and looked at Sarah. You must think a lot about my wife, Sarah. Is that a compliment or do you just have nothing to ask? There was a chuckle in the room. Sarah froze for a second. She hadn't expected the first answer to be so accurate. But she wasn't going to give up. I think many people are interested to know what it's like to be Donald Trump's wife. It's no secret that your image is very, how can I say it, dominant. Doesn't that put pressure on her? Trump's smile widened. If you ever talk to Melania, you would know that no one can pressure her. She makes her own decisions. She is a strong woman, and that is why we are together. The room buzzed. The answer was perfect. Sarah didn't back down. But she is practically invisible in the media space. It seems that she prefers to remain in the shadows. Trump paused again. Sarah, let me ask you. Do you often appear in fashion magazines? Are you often discussed as a style icon? She narrowed her eyes. I'm a journalist, Mr. Trump, I'm not in fashion. Exactly. And Melania is not a politician or a reality TV star. She is not obliged to live in front of the cameras. She does what she thinks is right. And you know what? I respect her for that. More applause. Sarah felt that the audience was clearly on Trump's side. Moving on to a more pressing topic. Sarah decided not to stop. But there were a lot of rumors about your marriage. About disagreements, about her sometimes not supporting your decisions. Doesn't that bother you? Trump laughed. Oh, Sarah, of course there were rumors. You work in the media, you know better who creates them. But let me ask you, if tomorrow the press writes that you are a secret agent of the government, will you start making excuses? Sarah rolled her eyes. This is absurd. Of course, it's absurd. That's exactly how we treat rumors in our family. She pressed her lips together. So you want to say that there was not a single crisis in your marriage? Sarah, have you ever been married? She frowned. What does it matter? Enormous. Because if you were, you would know that in every marriage there are moments when people argue, when they have different views. This is called a relationship. Not what you call a crisis. There was another burst of laughter in the room. Trump continued. But here's the difference: when Melania and I have different opinions, we discuss them at home, not through newspapers and talk shows. You may find this hard to understand, but not everything in life is done for the sake of headlines. Applause. Louder now. Sarah makes the final push. Sarah realized that she was losing the initiative. She decided to ask the most pressing question. She looked at him and, after a pause, said, "Some people think that your wife is unhappy in her marriage. What would you tell them?" The hall became quiet again. Trump took his time answering. He leaned forward slightly again, looked Sarah straight in the eye, and said calmly, "I would tell them one thing: ask her." She raised her eyebrows slightly. "Ask her yourself. You are a journalist, right? You say you want to convey the truth. Then don't guess, don't create theories, don't interpret other people's emotions. Just interview her and ask." Sarah opened her mouth, but immediately closed it. Trump continued. "And you know what I'll tell you? She'll answer you. But I'm sure you won't like her answer." At that moment the hall exploded with applause. Sarah lost this round. Trump seizes initiative. Now he didn't wait for questions, he began to speak himself. "This is what I want to say to everyone here. We live in a world where everyone thinks they can judge someone else's life based on the headlines. But real life is not in the newspapers. Not in the talk shows. And definitely not in the comments on social media." The hall fell silent again. "My wife is an independent person. She made a choice to be with me because she wants to, not because someone imposed it on her. And if you really want to know the truth, ask her. But I'm sure you won't like the answer, because it won't fit into your beautiful story." He looked at Sarah. "Now, Sarah, do you have any more substantive questions? Or can we talk about something really important?" She pressed her lips together, flipped through her notes, and nodded. "Let's move on to the next topic." But everyone already knew that Trump had won this round. The real confrontation is still ahead, but he not only withstood the first blow, but also turned it into his victory. Chapter 4: Answers Without Fear. Trump Takes Control. The tension in the room was still there. Sarah Miller, despite several failed attempts to corner Trump, was not going to give in. She was confident, but the audience felt her position was wavering. Trump, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease. He leaned back in his chair, clasped his hands, and smiled slightly, as if he was enjoying the exchange. Sarah looked at her notes and decided to change tactics. "Mr. Trump, since we are talking about family, let me ask you one more question. Many people believe that your wife, as First Lady, was not as active as her predecessors. Do you really think that she coped with her role?" Some spectators began to whisper. It was a subtle reference to Michelle Obama, whose public activism has been enormous. But Trump did not rise to the provocation. "Sarah, I have a question. Have you ever heard the expression, different people, different approaches?" She raised her eyebrows. "Certainly. That's great. Because that's what sets my wife apart. She's never been the kind of person who does things for the sake of popularity. She worked the way she thought was right and didn't try to imitate anyone else. And if you think success is measured by the number of appearances in front of the cameras, then I'm afraid you don't understand the real work." The audience applauded. Sarah crossed her arms. "Are you saying that she had no desire to be an active First Lady?" Trump chuckled. "I want to say that she was exactly the First Lady she wanted to be. Not the one the journalists wanted her to be." Applause again. Sarah tensed up, but still decided to make another attempt. But the public expected more from her. Wasn't it a mistake not to live up to those expectations? Trump leaned forward slightly. Sarah, the public expected a lot from me too. But I always did what I thought was right. And believe me, my wife is not one to adjust to the expectations of people who don't even know her personally. The room buzzed. Trump was not just fending off questions, he was seizing the initiative, turning criticism into an argument in his favor. Changing the subject, attempting a second strike. Sarah realized that there was no point in pursuing this topic further. She sighed, flipped through the notes, and moved on to another question. Okay, let's talk about something else. Many people think that your management style was too tough, that you didn't listen to your advisors. Is that true? Trump laughed. Let's figure it out. Tough on whom? On America's enemies? Yes. On people who tried to manipulate politics? Yes. On those who wanted the US to become weaker? Of course. He paused and then added. But you know what's interesting? Those who call me tough are the same people who have failed to achieve anything except chaos. The audience applauded. Sarah, however, did not back down. But sometimes even members of your team said that it was not easy to work with you. Trump chuckled. You know, working in business, and then in the White House, is not a sandbox game. Of course, it was not easy. But the question is, what did they expect? That I would sit back and be afraid to make decisions? The hall became noisy again. Trump leaned closer to the microphone. When you want to achieve results, you need strong decisions. Weakness brings nothing. The last attack, an unexpected question. Sarah looked at him carefully. She knew Trump was not losing control. Then she decided to take an unexpected step. You often talk about your confidence, about your strength, but tell me honestly, was there a moment in your career when you doubted yourself? When you weren't sure that you could handle it? The question caught some viewers off guard. It was different. Personal. Trump thought for a moment. And then, to everyone's surprise, he answered honestly. Of course. Every strong person has doubted at least once. The only difference is whether you give up or keep going. Sarah raised her eyebrows. And when was that? Trump chuckled slightly. When I decided to run for president. Many people said that I had no chance. I saw how all the media ridiculed me, how politicians bet on other candidates. Yes, there was a moment when I thought, what if they are right? He paused. But you know what I realized? They said that because they were afraid I would succeed. And you know what? I succeeded. The hall exploded with applause. Sarah looked at him and nodded. She realized that there was no point in attacking any further. Final words. Trump leaned back in his chair and looked at the audience. This is what I want to say. In life, it doesn't matter how many times you are criticized. It doesn't matter how many people want to break you. What matters is whether you believe in yourself. He looked at Sarah. You asked me a lot of questions today. I think I have one for you now. She narrowed her eyes. Which? If you had the opportunity to change something in this interview, what would it be? The hall held its breath. Sarah thought for a second. And then, with a small smile, she said. I would ask you even more difficult questions. Trump laughed. Well, that's your style, Sarah. And I respect you for that. The hall exploded with applause. He didn't just win this round. He did it brilliantly. Chapter 5, The Final Chord, Who Outsmarted Who? The applause in the room continued. Trump leaned back in his chair, pausing triumphantly, as if enjoying the moment. Sarah Miller, though smiling, clearly realized that her attempts to corner him had failed. She held herself confidently, but there was a slight confusion in her eyes. Mr. Trump, she finally said, waiting for the room to calm down a bit. I think no one will argue that you know how to answer difficult questions. But I have one more. Trump grinned. Sarah, if I didn't have difficult questions, I'd be bored. Come on, your last chance. There was laughter in the hall. You say that you never retreat. That you always move forward, no matter what. But if you could go back and change something in your life, what would it be? This question was unexpected. It was not offensive, it was personal. Trump tilted his head slightly, as if considering his answer. Interesting question, Sarah. Actually, I have an answer. He paused, looked out into the room, and then added. I would work even harder. The room began to buzz again. Sarah raised an eyebrow slightly. So you don't regret anything? Not a single decision. Not a single mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. But if you look back too much, you forget to look forward. And that's why I never dwell on the past. It's already happened. What's important is what happens next. The final exchange of blows. Sarah Miller looked at him carefully. She knew that this conversation would remain in her memory for a long time. So you are sure that you did the right thing in everything? Trump smiled. I am sure that every step I took led me to where I am. And if I had not made difficult decisions, had not met with journalists like you, I would not have been able to prove my case. She chuckled. That was a good answer, Mr. Trump. Thank you, Sarah. And your last question wasn't so bad. The audience laughed again. Trump has the last word. The moderator rose from his seat to announce the end of the interview, but Trump suddenly raised his hand. Wait, I have one question for Sarah. The presenter nodded in surprise. Certainly. Sarah Miller folded her hands in her lap and looked at him. You asked me tough questions. That's your job. But let me ask you, have you ever had to defend your decisions the way I do? When people tried to convince you that you were wrong, but you knew you were doing the right thing? Sarah was a little taken aback. She was silent for a couple of seconds, then nodded. Of course. Any person who goes against the system faces this. Trump grinned. You see. You and I are not that different. Someone in the hall gasped quietly. Sarah looked at him, then shook her head and chuckled. You know how to surprise, Mr. Trump. That's what I'm doing. Applause and recognition. The moderator took the floor. On this note, we conclude our discussion. Let us thank our guest for an interesting and vivid conversation. The hall exploded with applause. Sarah Miller, realizing the battle was over, extended her hand. Trump shook it firmly and confidently. You're a good opponent, Sarah. I appreciate your drive. She chuckled. And your endurance. They exchanged one last look of hidden respect, and then Trump turned and, still confident, walked out of the room. This evening will be remembered by everyone.